The sunlight streamed gently through the window as Margaret stepped out her car and walked up the short stone path to her son's front door. It was one of those mild, quiet Sundays that seemed designed for family visits and warm conversation. Birds chirped softly in the trees lining the driveway, and a faint breeze rustled the hydrangeas by the porch. Margaret had baked her famous lemon scones and wrapped them neatly in a checker cloth, eager to share them over coffee. Daniel greeted her at the door with a hug and his usual cheerful grin. "Hey, Mom, you're right on time." Before Margaret could even set her purse down, Claire appeared, her smile wide and her eyes bright with excitement. "Hi, Margaret. I'm so glad you came. I made you something special," she said, holding out a porcelain mug with both hands. The cup was decorated with tiny lavender sprigs, one of Margaret's favorite motifs. "Oh, how thoughtful," Margaret replied warmly as she accepted the cup. The coffee was piping hot, but as she brought it closer to her nose, her expression subtly shifted. The smell was unusual, not bad, but peculiar. There was something sharp in the aroma, like cloves or cinnamon, mixed with an unfamiliar, almost medicinal note. It was far stronger than what she was used to. Still smiling, she gave a slight nod and pretended to sip. Smells interesting," she said, carefully setting the cup down on the side table. The living room was cozy and bright, filled with soft cushions and the faint scent of vanilla candles. Claire's mother, Diane, sat in an armchair by the window, flipping through a gardening magazine. She looked up and greeted Margaret with a polite smile. As Daniel and Claire stepped into the kitchen to check on the oven, Margaret leaned over and asked Diane if she would like a cup of coffee. "Claire made this special blend, but I haven't really had mine yet," she said lightly. "Would you mind taking it? I'm actually more in the mood for tea." Diane chuckled and said, "Sure, I'll try it." She's always coming up with something new. Without hesitation, she took the cup and sipped from it. Margaret watched discreetly, then rose to make herself a cup of chamomile instead. The rest of the morning passed pleasantly. They all sat around the table, chatting about the garden, Daniel's new work project, and a book club Margaret had recently joined. Claire moved about the room with energy, occasionally checking the oven or offering more scones. Her enthusiasm was obvious. She seemed eager to impress. But despite the cheerful air, Margaret couldn't fully relax. She noticed Diane blinking slowly, her posture gradually sagging in the armchair. At first, it seemed like she was simply tired. Then came the noise. From the kitchen, there was a sudden clatter, a pot clanging hard against the floor, followed by a startled, muffled scream. Claire gasped and darted out her seat. Daniel shot up as well, rushing toward the noise. Margaret's heart jumped as she stood, the room spinning slightly as adrenaline kicked in. Something wasn't right. They hurried into the kitchen to find Diane hunched over by the counter, one hand gripping the edge for support, the other waving weakly in front of her face. Her cheeks were flushed, and she looked dazed. A pot had indeed fallen, rolling slightly on the floor beside her. "I feel really hot all of a sudden," Diane said, her voice faint but strained. "Like I'm burning up." Claire rushed to her side, panicked. "Oh my God, are you okay? Sit down, sit down." Margaret helped guide Diane to a chair, her own pulse racing. As she handed Diane a cold cloth, her eyes met Claire's, who looked utterly confused and terrified. "I don't know what's happening," Claire stammered. "She was fine a minute ago. I didn't do anything." But Margaret wasn't so sure. Without saying a word, she glanced at the empty lavender cup on the side table, now completely drained. The sharp aroma still lingered faintly in the air. And in that moment, a quiet thought crept into her mind, not of accusation but concern. What exactly had been in that coffee? Diane sat at the kitchen table, pale and visibly shaken, clutching the cool cloth to her forehead as Claire fluttered around her, pulling open drawers and rummaging through cabinets for anything that might help. Daniel stood nearby, tense and uncertain, his hands shoved into his pockets as if afraid to touch anything. Margaret remained quiet, watching everything with a measured calm, but inside her thoughts were racing. Claire had knelt beside Diane, asking again and again if she needed water, if she should call someone, if she was allergic to anything. Her concern seemed genuine, even frantic. But Margaret couldn't help noticing how little control she had over her own panic. "I'm okay," Diane murmured, her voice shaky. "Just lightheaded. It hit me so fast." Margaret stepped in, placing a gentle hand on Diane's shoulder. "Let's get you to the couch. You'll be more comfortable there." Daniel helped steady his mother-in-law as they guided her back into the living room. She sank into the couch cushions with a heavy sigh. Claire hovered beside her, holding a glass of water and biting her lip. The scent of the mystery coffee had faded by now, replaced by the more familiar smells of baked scones and the faint floral air freshener Claire liked to use, but the tension in the air remained thick. "I really don't understand what happened," Claire said finally, breaking the silence. She seemed fine after the coffee. "I just thought it would give her a little energy boost." Margaret tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly did you put in it?" Claire hesitated. "Just some cinnamon, nutmeg, a little maca powder, and something I found in that blog I follow. It's a blend of thermogenic herbs, all natural." Margaret nodded slowly, storing that information away without reacting. "I see. Where did you get the blend from?" Claire's eyes flicked toward the hallway. "It came in a sampler box. It's supposed to boost metabolism and help with fatigue. Lots of good reviews." Daniel cleared his throat, sensing the direction of the conversation. "I mean, maybe it just didn't sit well with her. Happens all the time, right?" Margaret didn't answer. She turned back to Diane, who was now sitting up a little straighter, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "Do you feel well enough to go home? I can take you if you'd like." Diane gave a small nod. "Yes, I think I need to lie down somewhere quiet." Claire looked stricken. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to make you feel sick." Diane reached out and patted Claire's hand. "I know, honey. It's all right. I just need to rest." The ride to Diane's house was quiet. Margaret drove with steady hands, glancing occasionally at the rearview mirror to check on Diane, who sat in the back seat with her eyes closed. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, just contemplative. Margaret waited until they had pulled into Diane's driveway before she finally spoke. "Did it taste strange to you? The coffee?" Diane blinked, then nodded slowly. "Yes, it was strong. Spicy. I only drank half. But after a few minutes, I felt warm, like my face was flushed and my heart was racing." Margaret sighed. "I'm glad you said that. I had a feeling something was off." "You think Claire meant to do something?" Diane asked gently. "No, I think she's trying too hard to impress, but she's being careless." Margaret paused. "It worries me." After making sure Diane was safely inside and resting, Margaret returned to her own home. The afternoon had grown long, the sky turning a soft golden hue. She sat at her kitchen table, pouring herself a cup of plain black tea. The familiar bitterness grounded her. She couldn't shake the unease that had settled in her chest. It wasn't about the coffee anymore. It was about trust, about instincts. Claire was part of the family now, but something about her eagerness to control every detail, especially the food, was beginning to feel less like enthusiasm and more like obsession. That evening, Margaret called Daniel. He answered on the second ring, sounding tired. "Hey, Mom, everything all right?" "Yes, I just wanted to check on Diane." "And Claire's still upset. She keeps going over what happened, trying to figure out where she went wrong." Margaret chose her words carefully. "You know, sometimes it's not about figuring out one mistake. Sometimes it's about realizing there's a pattern." Daniel didn't respond right away. "Are you saying she's done this before?" "I'm saying she's experimenting without fully understanding what she's doing. Today could have been worse." He sighed. "She just wants to help. She reads all these blogs, listens to health podcasts. She wants to be the best version of herself, you know? For us. I know, but there's a fine line between being proactive and being reckless." There was a long pause. "I'll talk to her." The next morning, Margaret received a text from Claire. "Thank you for helping with Mom yesterday. I feel terrible. I'm going to review everything I've been using. I promise." Margaret stared at the message for a while before responding. "I believe you meant well. Let's be more careful together. Maybe we can learn something from this." She left it at that. A few days passed. Diane recovered quickly, though she avoided any further discussions about the incident. Claire, meanwhile, seemed subdued during a brief video call. Her usual energy was muted, her eyes downcast. Margaret sensed the embarrassment hadn't faded. But something told her this wasn't the end of it. There was more to uncover, not out of suspicion, but out of care. If Claire was relying on unverified sources, if she felt pressure to perform as the perfect daughter-in-law, then Margaret needed to understand why. Later that week, she decided to do her own bit of research. She looked up the ingredients Claire had mentioned and found herself on a blog filled with bright pictures and enthusiastic language, but very little scientific grounding. The comments section was revealing. Some readers loved the results. Others reported nausea, dizziness, and heart palpitations. The author wasn't a certified nutritionist, just a self-described wellness coach with a flair for marketing. Margaret felt her jaw tighten. These were the sources Claire trusted? She clicked through more entries, each one filled with colorful smoothie bowls, supplement recommendations, and wellness detox routines. The language was persuasive, almost seductive in its promise of control and perfection. Suddenly, Margaret understood something deeper. Claire wasn't just experimenting. She was searching for something. Maybe confidence, maybe security, and maybe, without realizing it, she was putting everyone around her in a position of risk just to feel like she was doing everything right. Margaret closed the laptop, her decision firming. The next time she saw Claire, they would talk, really talk. Not as adversaries, not as in-laws, but as two women trying to care for the people they loved. And maybe, just maybe, they could help each other understand how to do that a little better. The following Saturday afternoon, the sun filtered gently through the window panes of Margaret's small but tidy kitchen as she carefully chopped fresh herbs for a soup she planned to bring over to Diane. It was a simple gesture, but she felt compelled to offer some comfort, not only to her son's mother-in-law, but also as a means to quietly stay close to the unfolding situation. She had not seen Claire in person since the coffee incident, and though they exchanged a few cordial texts, Margaret sensed the awkward tension hadn't quite settled. As she tightened the lid on the container of soup and placed it into her basket, Margaret received a new message from Daniel. Claire wants to make things right. She's planning a dinner tonight. Wants everyone to come. Think you'll join? She stared at the screen, considering. A group meal felt like a bold step, maybe too bold. But then again, perhaps this was exactly the kind of setting in which unspoken tensions could be softened, if not resolved. She replied with a simple "I'll be there." When Margaret arrived at Daniel and Claire's house that evening, she was met with an air of nervous anticipation. Claire opened the door, dressed casually but with noticeable care. Her hair pulled back, a faint trace of lip gloss, a slightly forced smile. "Hi, Margaret," she said, stepping aside. "I'm really glad you came." Inside, the dining table was already set, and the smell of something savory, spiced, but not overwhelming, drifted through the air. Diane sat at the far end of the couch, looking more rested and composed than she had a week ago, though she greeted Margaret with a quick, knowing glance. Daniel busied himself lighting a small candle at the center of the table, clearly trying to maintain a light atmosphere. "I've kept it simple," Claire explained as she guided Margaret to a seat. "Vegetable stew, lentil fritters, and a detox tea. No exotic ingredients, I promise." Margaret gave a warm but measured smile. "Sounds lovely." The dinner began calmly enough. Conversation revolved around mild topics: Diane's latest gardening experiment, Daniel's work updates, a funny story about their neighbor's cat, all sprinkled with careful politeness. Margaret watched Claire closely, noting how she kept glancing toward everyone's plates, as if silently monitoring reactions. But midway through the meal, as Diane reached for a second fritter, she paused and frowned slightly. "This has an unusual texture. What's in it?" Claire perked up, immediately defensive. "It's just red lentils, chia seeds, a touch of spirulina." Margaret set her fork down. "Spirulina?" Claire's cheeks flushed. "It's perfectly safe, full of nutrients. I only added a pinch." Diane set the fritter back on her plate. "I'm sure it's healthy. I just wasn't expecting it." Daniel cleared his throat. "Maybe next time we keep things a little more familiar?" Claire's face tensed. "I'm trying. I really am." But I also want to share the things I care about. Food isn't just nutrition for me. It's my way of contributing, of being useful. I'm not trying to force anything. Margaret's voice was soft but firm. But when people start feeling unwell, even by accident, it stops being about care and starts becoming something else, something harder to trust. Claire looked down at her plate. I thought if I followed the recipes, the reviews, the trends, I thought it would make me a better host, a better wife, a better daughter. But I feel like I'm always failing. The room fell silent. After a long pause, Diane spoke gently. Claire, no one's asking you to prove anything. We know you mean well. But maybe less trying to impress, and more just being present, would go a long way. Claire blinked back tears, visibly touched by the sentiment, but still weighed down by frustration. I've been following this new program, she said quietly. A full wellness plan. They send you weekly ingredients, recipes, even guided meditations. It's supposed to restore your inner harmony, whatever that means. But now I'm starting to question everything, even the simple things. Margaret gave a nod. It's okay to question. That's the first sign of wisdom. But maybe you need to stop listening to strangers on the internet and start talking to someone who actually understands this. Someone trained to help. Claire hesitated. You mean a nutritionist? Yes, someone who can guide you, not just for your sake, but for all of us. We're family. We want to support you, not just react to what happens after the fact. Daniel placed a hand over Claire's. I think it's a good idea. We've both been guessing too much. For the first time that evening, Claire seemed to relax. Not fully, but enough to let the tension soften around her shoulders. All right, I'll look into it. But will you come with me? Margaret was caught off guard by the request, but recovered quickly. If it helps you feel more comfortable, of course I will. Claire smiled faintly. Thank you. The rest of the evening unfolded with less strain. The tea, though still slightly earthy, was palatable. The conversation turned toward more hopeful topics, vacation ideas, upcoming community events, even a possible family picnic. There were still shadows lingering in the room, but they no longer dominated the space. Instead, there was a shared understanding beginning to form, one rooted not in suspicion or conflict, but in a collective desire to move forward together. Later that night, as Margaret drove home under a clear, moonlit sky, she reflected on the shift she had seen in Claire. Vulnerability had taken the place of pretense, and with it came the possibility of healing. It wouldn't be instant, and it wouldn't be easy, but it would be real. And that, she thought, was worth more than any superfood or miracle spice could offer. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner at Daniel and Claire's house. Though the atmosphere that night had ended on a hopeful note, Margaret couldn't silence the subtle tension that continued to buzz beneath her thoughts. There had been no major incident since, but her instincts, which had served her well through years of motherhood and careful observation, told her that the situation hadn't fully stabilized. Claire had mentioned looking into a nutritionist, but no follow-up had come from Daniel or her. Margaret didn't want to push too hard, not after Claire's vulnerable admission, yet the silence was becoming more uncomfortable than reassuring. So she waited, watched, and quietly kept track of details others might have overlooked. One afternoon, Margaret stopped by unannounced under the pretense of dropping off a bag of oranges she had picked from her neighbor's tree. Claire opened the door, surprised but polite as always. "Oh, Margaret, that's sweet of you. Come in for a minute?" Margaret stepped inside and immediately noticed a faint scent of ginger and citrus. Not unpleasant, but strong enough to suggest another one of Claire's brewing experiments. On the kitchen counter, several glass jars lined up neatly, each filled with vibrant colored liquids: deep green, pale yellow, rusty orange. There were notes scribbled on note card beside them, each labeled with combinations like immune shot, gut tonic, and morning flush. Claire followed Margaret's gaze, offering a sheepish smile. "Just try out a few blends I saw in a video series. No spices this time. All raw ingredients, organic juices, herbs, a bit of sea moss." Margaret gave a quiet nod and placed the oranges gently on the table. "It certainly looks involved." "I'm not giving up on wellness," Claire said, almost offensively. but I'm being more mindful now. Watching doses, logging everything. I've even started a binder. Here, look. She pulled a thick folder from a drawer, opening it to reveal organized pages of printed articles, highlighted sections, and handwritten notes. It was an impressive effort, perhaps even admirable. But as Margaret flipped through, a cold knot tightened in her stomach. These are from blogs, she said softly, not peer-reviewed journals. And some of these names, Gut, Reset Cleanse, Alkaline Boost Elixir, Claire, they sound like marketing gimmicks. Claire took the folder back, gently but firmly. Maybe, but they're working for people. Look at the comments, the reviews. Margaret's tone remained calm. And if something goes wrong again, if someone reacts poorly, you Diane Daniel, will the comment section help then? Claire paused, visibly uncomfortable. I'm being careful. I haven't offered anything to anyone else since the dinner. Just testing for myself now. That was something, Margaret thought. A start. But the concern hadn't faded. It had simply shifted. Claire's need for control, for approval, for achievement. It wasn't gone. It was evolving. Before she left, Margaret noticed a packet of powders on the windowsill, branded with words like restore, revitalize, and cleanse. None of them carried any certification symbols. She didn't say anything, but she made a mental note of the names. That evening, back at home, Margaret took out her laptop and searched for the brand labels. What she found only deepened her worry. Several of the products were flagged on consumer watchdog sites. Some had been linked to mild health complaints, headaches, dizziness, stomach pain. The testimonials on the official site were glowing, of course, but the forums painted a more complex picture. Still, she said nothing to Daniel. Not yet. A few days later, she attended a small gathering at Diane's house, just a quiet tea afternoon with a few mutual acquaintances. Diane seemed cheerful, in better spirits, and more steady than she had been in the past weeks. As they sat by the window, sipping tea, Diane leaned in slightly. Claire dropped off one of her new concoctions yesterday. A green drink. I told her I'd try it later, but I poured it down the sink. Margaret blinked. You did. Diane smiled faintly. I know she means well, but I'm not a guinea pig. I've decided to keep things simple from now on. Water, tea, and occasional ginger snap. Margaret returned the smile, a quiet relief washing over her. That sounded wise. But she seemed disappointed. Diane added, not angry, just deflated, like I had let her down. Margaret nodded slowly. She's carrying more pressure than she knows what to do with. It's not about the drinks or the meals. It's about feeling useful, feeling seen. Diane reached for another biscuit. Maybe she just needs permission to let go a little. Not everything has to be earned. That evening, Margaret sat in her reading chair with a novel open in her lap, but she wasn't turning pages. Her mind replayed the moments of the past few weeks. The patterns, the warnings, the restraint Claire was trying to impose on herself. She didn't doubt Claire's intentions, but she worried about the slow buildup of tension beneath all that effort. The problem wasn't dramatic. There was no obvious villain, no catastrophic fallout. But Margaret knew from experience that sometimes the most dangerous things are the quietest, the subtle, accumulating ones, like the pressure to be perfect. She made a decision. The next time they spoke, she would no longer sidestep the issue, not with accusation, but with honesty. The well-being of the family, including Claire, depended on more than careful recipes. It depended on trust, communication, and knowing when to ask for real help. And that moment, she sensed, was very close. Margaret found herself waking earlier than usual that Tuesday morning, the sky still pale and tinged with the soft gray of dawn. She sat in her robe, sipping tea in silence as the kitchen slowly filled with light. Her thoughts circled a single, quiet question that had been forming in the back of her mind. How long had this really been going on? She hadn't kept track before the coffee incident. Claire's recipes and health talks had always seemed more like a quirky hobby than a potential problem. But now, looking back with sharper lens, Margaret began to notice a trail of little incidents, moments she had brushed off at the time, but which suddenly took on new meaning. A year ago at Thanksgiving, Margaret remembered a roasted root salad Claire had made. Everyone had complimented it politely, though several family members, including Daniel, had quietly suffered bloating and discomfort afterward. Diana complained of a headache the next day, blaming the wine, but now Margaret wondered. There had also been that birthday brunch last spring. Claire had made bright green pancakes using matcha and some unknown protein powder. Daniel had barely touched his plate. Margaret recalled how he had smiled tightly and said he wasn't feeling well that morning. At the time, she had assumed it was nerves from a work presentation the following day. Now she wasn't so sure. She opened her notebook, the one she used to jot down household tasks and shopping lists, and began writing dates, events, and brief notes of what she remembered. By mid-morning, she had compiled a list of 8 distinct occasions over the past year when someone in the family had reported fatigue, stomach issues, headaches, or sudden warmth after eating something Claire had prepared. None had been serious. None had even seemed connected until now. Margaret stared at the list for a long time, then quietly closed the notebook. That same afternoon, she visited the local library, bypassing the wellness section and heading straight for the medical and nutrition aisles. She selected 2 titles written by registered dietitians and one focused on common food-related ailments. She wasn't looking to diagnose anyone. She simply needed to understand what could go wrong when someone, even with good intentions, dabbled in dietary combinations without proper training. By the time she left the library, the sun was beginning to lower, and Margaret decided to stop at the market on the way home. As she reached for a bunch of parsley, she heard a familiar voice down the aisle. "Margaret?" It was Susan, a family acquaintance and the mother of one of Daniel's old high school friends. They hadn't seen each other in a while, and after a few moments of friendly catching up, Susan mentioned something curious. "I saw Claire's post the other day. One of her drinks went a little viral on that wellness app. She's really getting into this health stuff, huh?" Margaret blinked. "What post?" "Oh, some blend with lemon, cayenne, sea moss, and I think activated charcoal. She filmed herself making it, and then talked about its anti-inflammation power. Honestly, it looked like something out of a lab." Trying not to let her concerns show, Margaret smiled faintly. "That's Claire, always experimenting." Susan chuckled. "Well, she certainly has an audience. People were asking for exact proportions in the comments." Back home, Margaret searched for the video. It didn't take long to find. Claire had joined a niche wellness platform that encouraged users to share their homemade remedies, and her video, just under 3 minutes long, had been viewed over 1,000 times. In the clip, she appeared upbeat and confident, demonstrating her process with smooth narration and crisp editing. Margaret watched the entire video in silence, then scrolled through the comment section. Some viewers were enthusiastic, eager to try it. Others asked about side effects. One person mentioned dizziness. Another said it felt like fire in their stomach. Claire had replied each with reassuring tones, suggesting they lower the dose or try it with food. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She wasn't angry, not yet, but something inside her was shifting. The more she saw, the more she recognized a dangerous loop. Claire was seeking validation, sharing incomplete knowledge, receiving applause, and reinforcing her sense of authority. But the more public it became, the more real the consequences could be. It was no longer a family matter. Strangers were now taking her suggestions seriously. 2 days later, Margaret visited Daniel at his office during lunch. Under the guise of delivering a few files he had accidentally left at her house. They sat in the building's small cafe, a quiet corner near the window. After some light conversation, Margaret gently transitioned to the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Daniel, have you seen what Claire's been posting lately?" He looked slightly uneasy. "Yeah, she showed me. She's really proud of it." "I'm concerned." "I know. You've said that before." Margaret pulled out the folded list she had copied for her notebook. "But I've started tracking incidents. Not just mine. Not just Diane's. Yours, too." Daniel frowned. "Mom, this isn't about blame," she said softly. "It's about patterns. About things we've ignored for too long. And now she has an audience. People she doesn't even know are copying her. Daniel rubbed his temple. She just wants to be taken seriously. She's finally found something that gives her confidence. At what cost? He was quiet. Margaret reached across the table. This is a woman who needs support, yes, but she also needs someone to gently bring her back to solid ground. I'm willing to do that with her. Are you? He nodded slowly. I am. Margaret exhaled, her grip loosening on the paper. As she left the office building, she felt a slight breeze lift her scarf. The world outside buzzed as usual. Cars passing, voices in the distance, the faint sound of a street performer's guitar. But within her, a resolve had formed. It was time to address the pattern, not just the symptoms. Claire needed more than caution. She needed clarity, guidance, and someone willing to walk alongside her, not behind, not ahead, but beside. The following weekend, Margaret was invited once again to Daniel and Claire's house. This time for a small afternoon gathering Claire had organized to test some energizing refreshments she'd been developing. Though the invitation was framed casually, Margaret felt an immediate prickle of apprehension. The term refreshments had taken on a new and uncertain meaning in recent weeks. She had already agreed with Daniel that they would monitor things more closely and, above all, avoid confrontation in front of others. Still, she sensed that this afternoon would not pass without consequence. When she arrived, Diane was already seated in the living room, flipping through a home and lifestyle magazine, her expression neutral. Claire stood near the kitchen counter, arranging tall glass jars filled with a deep violet liquid, topped with fresh herbs and slices of orange. She turned when she saw Margaret and smiled, though her eyes seemed tight with anticipation. Just in time, she said brightly. I was about to bring these over. Margaret offered a polite nod. They look festive. They're great for circulation and focus, Claire added, handing one glass to Diane and another to Daniel, who had just entered from the hallway, adjusting his shirt collar. Margaret watched as Diane accepted the glass but didn't drink. Instead, she placed it on a side table with a faint smile and leaned back in her chair. Daniel sniffed as cautiously, then took a small sip, offering Claire a brief but uncertain smile. Claire turned to Margaret with a final glass, pausing for a moment before offering it. I know you've had concerns, she said carefully, but I promise I've kept it light. No powders, no heat, just fruits and herbs. Margaret accepted the glass without a word, holding it but not drinking. She noticed the aroma was strong, hibiscus, lemon balm, maybe elderberry, pleasant but assertive. Before she could respond, Diane suddenly cleared her throat. Claire, she said gently, I hope you don't mind, but I'd rather not try this one. Claire's smile faltered. Oh, it's very mild. Really? Diane glanced at Margaret, then back at Claire. It's not about the ingredients. I'm just not comfortable experimenting anymore. I prefer to stick to tea or water, if that's all right. The room fell quiet for a beat too long. Claire's jaw tensed. I understand, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She turned toward the kitchen without another word, the tray still in her hands. Daniel broke the silence by standing and offering to help her put things away. Claire didn't object, but her body language was stiff. Margaret remained seated, her glass untouched, observing everything with quiet unease. From the kitchen, low voices began to rise in volume, not shouting, but sharp enough to pierce the calm. Diane leaned toward Margaret and whispered, I didn't want to upset her, but she needs to know where I stand. Margaret nodded, her voice just above a murmur. You did the right thing. Through the doorway, Claire's voice suddenly sharpened. I'm not poisoning anyone, Daniel. I'm trying to make something beautiful, something helpful, but no one wants to believe that. Margaret and Diane exchanged a glance. Moments later, Claire reappeared, wiping her hands on a towel. Her expression was strained but composed. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to get upset. I feel like I'm being judged for caring. Margaret stood, choosing her words carefully. No one's judging you for caring, Claire. But care means listening, too. Listening to hesitation, to discomfort, even to silence. When someone says no, we respect that. That's what makes care mutual. Claire looked at her, eyes glassy. I don't know how to stop. I feel like if I let go of this, I let go of everything I've worked toward. Daniel returned, placing the now empty tray on the dining table. No one's asking you to give up everything, he said quietly. But you can't keep pushing when people are clearly asking you to slow down. Claire's composure broke just slightly, her shoulders sagging. I didn't think I was pushing. I thought I was contributing. You are, Margaret said, her voice gentle. But contribution doesn't mean control. It means presence, participation, and sometimes knowing when to step back. The tension didn't vanish. It lingered like the faint tang of herbs in the air. But for the first time, it didn't feel unspoken. It had a name, a shape, a weight shared. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the trees and the gathering slowly dissolved, Margaret stepped out to the porch for a breath of fresh air. Diane joined her a moment later, the screen door creaking softly behind her. She's unraveling a little, Diane said, eyes on the garden. Margaret sighed. Yes, but maybe that's what she needs to do. Let it unravel before she can begin again, more grounded, more balanced. Diane nodded. I hope she gets there. Margaret looked out at the fading light. She won't have to do it alone. It was early afternoon when Margaret received an unexpected call from Claire. Her voice on the other end of the line was quieter than usual, stripped of the usual confidence and curated charm she often projected. There was a fragile honesty to it that caught Margaret off guard. Do you have a little time today? Claire asked. Margaret glanced at her planner, though she didn't need to. Yes, I do. Could you come by? I think I need to talk. Less than an hour later, Margaret arrived at their house. Claire greeted her at the door. No makeup, hair tied back loosely, and wearing a soft, worn sweater that made her look years younger. The air inside the house carried no sharp aromas, no brewed concoctions or simmering spices. Only the natural, comfortable scent of clean fabric and quiet. They settled in the den, not at the kitchen table this time, but on the couch, a more neutral ground. Claire held a warm mug of chamomile tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around it. I've been thinking a lot, she began. After the gathering, after what Diane said, I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying everything. Margaret waited. She had learned over the years that silence could be just as important as speech. I didn't realize how much I was chasing something, Claire continued, staring down into her tea. I thought if I could bring health, energy, creativity into the house, I'd be valuable. I don't work full-time like Daniel. I don't have children yet. I thought this was how I could define my role. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. And where do you think that pressure came from? Claire gave a faint, almost apologetic smile. Everywhere. Social media, books, people showing their perfect lives, perfect bodies, perfect meals. And deep down me, I always felt like I had to be more, like being enough, as I am was never quite sufficient. Margaret rested her hands in her lap. Claire, being part of family isn't about proving your worth. It's about presence, trust, and small, everyday efforts, the quiet kind. You don't need to reinvent the concept of care. Sometimes it's just showing up. Claire blinked quickly, her eyes moist. I think I knew that. But somewhere along the way, I stopped believing it. I started performing instead of connecting. And I didn't notice when I crossed a line between care and control. You were trying to help, Margaret said. But help given without listening becomes something else, even with good intentions. Claire nodded slowly. I keep thinking about that coffee, about Diane, about the drink I made for the last visit. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but I didn't stop to ask if they even wanted what I was offering. I assumed it was good because it came from a place of effort. Margaret reached for her tea. Effort without reflection can be dangerous. Even love, when it's rigid, can become harmful. There was a long pause. Claire's gaze drifted toward the window, where sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains. Do you think I need help? I think we all do, Margaret answered. But yes, in your case, professional guidance might help you distinguish between safe practices and risky ones. Not because you've done something malicious, but because you care so much it's clouding your judgment. Claire exhaled deeply, setting her mug down. Would you come with me? To see a nutritionist? I found one nearby. She has experience with behavioral patterns around food, not just diet. Margaret's expression softened. Of course I'll come. This isn't about shaming. It's about learning together. Claire smiled, tentative but real. I think I'm ready for that. To learn, to slow down. They sat for a few moments in companionable silence. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the branches of the oak tree in the yard, casting dappled shadows on the floor. Later that week, they visited the nutritionist together. Her office was calm, painted in soft greens and warm neutrals, with a scent of eucalyptus in the air. The appointment lasted nearly an hour, and the consultation was nothing like Claire had expected. It wasn't about calories or weight. It was about intention, understanding the body's signals, learning to distinguish evidence-based knowledge from trends. The profession explained how mixing certain herbal ingredients could trigger adverse reactions, especially when used frequently or without proper ratios. Claire listened intently, asked questions, took notes. At one point, she glanced at Margaret with something close to relief. For once, she wasn't alone in her effort, and she wasn't being judged, only guided. On the way home, they stopped at a cafe for lunch. Claire ordered a lentil soup and a small salad, and Margaret chose a roasted vegetable bowl. They ate slowly, enjoying the simplicity of the meal. You know, Claire said as she stirred her spoon, for the first time in months, I don't feel like I need to impress anyone at this table. Margaret smiled. That's the best kind of meal. Claire looked thoughtful. I think I'm going to take a break from the wellness videos, from the powders, from the elixirs. Not forever, but until I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. Margaret raised her glass of water, to starting from a place of peace. Claire clinked her glass gently. To listening, it was only the beginning. But it was the first time the conversation between them had been completely open, without subtext or hesitation. And that, Margaret thought, was something worth holding on to. The first week following their visit to the nutritionist marked a noticeable shift in Claire's routine. The kitchen, once an altar to complexity, lined with powders, tinctures, and jars filled with color-coded liquids, gradually returned to a more familiar, breathable space. Margaret visited again that Thursday at Claire's invitation and was met with an entirely different energy. The house was quieter, not in a hollow or strained way, but in a calm, settled sense, like the exhale after a long-held breath. Claire greeted her with a smile that wasn't forced this time. She wore a simple apron dusted lightly with flour, her hands faintly sticky from dough. On the counter rested a mixing bowl, half filled with a modest blend of oats, mashed bananas, and cinnamon. I'm baking, she said a little sheepishly. From scratch. No supplements, no experimental flours. Just real food. Margaret returned the smile. That sounds like something your grandmother might have made, and I mean that as a compliment. Claire laughed, and for a brief moment, she looked like someone entirely different, or maybe someone she had always been underneath the striving. They sat together at the kitchen table while the oven warmed the room, the scent of cinnamon and oats gradually curling through the air. Claire reached for her notebook, the same one she had once filled with detailed notes from health blogs and charts of herbal benefits. Now, it held clippings from reputable nutritional articles, some handwritten recipes annotated with simple notations. Tasted good? Too dry. Try again with walnuts. I'm trying to relearn food, she said, running her fingers along the spine of the notebook. Not just how it works with the body, but how it works in a family. How it becomes part of stories, memories. I missed that before. Margaret sipped her tea, her tone warm. It was always there. You just had to listen to the quieter lessons. Claire flipped to a clean page and began writing a new recipe title at the top. The nutritionist gave me homework, she said. She asked me to write down one family meal from memory, something that made me feel safe. I couldn't think of anything at first. I didn't really grow up with that kind of consistency. Margaret nodded slowly. That makes sense. But then I remembered this one time. I must have been 9. My aunt was visiting, and she made this really basic tomato soup with grilled cheese. We sat on the floor because our dining table was broken, and I remember it tasted perfect, not because of the food, but because everything felt okay. No one was trying to be anything. Margaret leaned back in her chair. That's the kind of nourishment that stays with you, not measured in nutrients, but in comfort. Claire closed the notebook. So I'm starting there. I want to cook that soup again. And then maybe a few of Daniel's childhood favorites. I asked him the other night. He said he misses my lasagna. The old version, not the quinoa one. They both laughed. The next appointment with the nutritionist was scheduled for the following week. This time, Claire went alone but called Margaret afterward, eager to share her experience. She spoke about learning to read food labels with discernment, how to understand ingredient sourcing, and the importance of moderation. The nutritionist had encouraged her to shift her perspective, to stop treating food as a performance and start viewing it as a relationship. A few days later, Claire invited Margaret and Diane over for lunch. It was to be her first fully balanced, nutritionist-approved meal, and not in the aspirational sense. It was a simple menu: roasted chicken with herbs, steamed vegetables, and a barley salad with lemon dressing. For dessert, Claire made small berry tarts using a straightforward recipe from a cooking magazine. The table was set without flair, just clean linen, real cutlery, and a small bouquet of wildflowers in a jar. Diane arrived with a cautious smile, but it warmed quickly when she caught the scent of rosemary and lemon in the air. "Everything smells lovely," she said, easing into her chair. "No hidden surprises," Claire replied with a grin. "You have my word." They ate slowly, and the conversation flowed easily. Diane shared an old story from her college days. Margaret mentioned a neighbor's escape artist dog, and Claire listened, occasionally contributing with her own bits of quiet humor. When it came time for dessert, Claire hesitated slightly before bringing the tarts to the table. "I know I used to make things that look like this, but these are different," she said. "Just berries, a light custard, and a butter crust. No sea moss. No activated charcoal." Diane laughed. "Now that's a relief." Margaret took a bite, closed her eyes briefly, and nodded with approval. "This is the kind of food that remembers who you are, and helps you remember, too." Claire's eyes softened. "That's what I'm hoping for." After the meal, while Diane rested in the living room, Margaret stayed behind to help with the dishes. Claire passed her a towel, and they worked quietly at first, the rhythm of water and movement creating its own gentle conversation. "I think I was trying to earn my place," Claire said after a while. "In this family, in this role, even in my own life. I thought if I could control something, food, health, outcomes, then I'd feel secure." Margaret dried a dish slowly. Control feels like safety, until it starts closing the door on the very things we want to protect. Claire nodded. "But I'm learning now. Real care doesn't shout. It listens. And that's what I want to offer from now on." Margaret placed the final plate in the cupboard. "Then you're already halfway there." As she stepped outside to leave, Margaret paused by the garden gate and looked back. Claire stood in the doorway, waving quietly, no mask of perfection in place, just a woman finding her way. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was unmistakably a new beginning. A few weeks had passed since the quiet lunch that had marked a turning point for Claire. The air around her had begun to change, less tense, more grounded. She no longer moved through the kitchen like a laboratory technician in a rush to prove something. Instead, her steps were steadier, her touch more relaxed. Margaret noticed the difference the moment she stepped into the house one crisp Saturday morning, invited to help prepare a new recipe. Claire greeted her with a calm expression, her apron already dusted with a light trace of flour. The counter was organized but not obsessively so. A set of ingredients lay in plain view: whole wheat flour, grated zucchini, fresh herbs, and a handwritten recipe clipped to a stand. "I thought we could make these zucchini cakes the nutritionist recommended," Claire said, gesturing to the counter. "Simple, savory, and surprisingly good with yogurt." Margaret washed her hands and took her place at the prep station, appreciating the balance in the scene. There was no hum of instructional videos playing in the background, no exotic packages cluttering the shelves. Just two women preparing a meal, one teaching, the other learning, both contributing. As they chopped, stirred, and shaped the cakes, conversation flowed easily. Claire spoke about her recent classes, not culinary, but mindfulness workshops she had found through the community center. Margaret listened with interest as Claire described a recent session focused on presence during routine tasks. They had us close our eyes while holding an orange, Claire said, smiling, to feel the texture, smell the skin, listen to the sound of peeling it. It sounds silly, but it made me realize how disconnected I become from the basic act of eating. I was always chasing the next benefit instead of tasting the moment. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. That's the kind of lesson that doesn't need to come from a book. It comes from slowing down long enough to notice what's already there. Once the zucchini cakes were sizzling lightly on the stovetop, Claire reached for the bowl of yogurt she had prepared earlier. It was seasoned with garlic, mint, and a hint of lemon, a traditional pairing she had adapted from one of Margaret's older recipes. As they plated the food together, Margaret felt a sense of quiet pride. Not because Claire was mimicking her style, but because she had finally found her own through respect rather than rebellion. They took the plates out to the small patio, where the morning sun cast long shadows across the table. Diane arrived shortly after, carrying a small bouquet of marigolds wrapped in tissue paper. "For the table," she said, handing them to Claire, "and to say thank you for including me again." Claire accepted the flowers with a smile. "It wouldn't feel right without you." As they sat and began to eat, the mood was warm and unforced. The zucchini cakes were crisp on the outside, soft within, and paired perfectly with the yogurt. Diane complimented the seasoning, and Claire chuckled. Margaret helped. "She's the quiet genius behind this one." Margaret waved the comment off. "You followed your instincts. That's what made the difference." The rest of the meal unfolded naturally. They talked about the community garden project Claire was considering joining, about Daniel's new role at work, and about an upcoming local food fair that Claire was now thinking of attending, not to showcase anything, but simply to explore and learn. After the meal, Diane lingered at the table, sipping her tea while Margaret and Claire cleared the plates. Back inside the kitchen, Claire opened a drawer and pulled out a small box. "I've been meaning to show you this," she said. Inside the box were recipe cards, each written in her neat hand. Some were familiar, dishes Margaret had introduced or adapted with her, while others were clearly Claire's own. "I'm building a real collection now," Claire said. "Recipes I've tested, meals that brought people together, dishes that didn't make anyone anxious." Margaret smiled. "You're building more than recipes. You're building connection." Claire looked at the cards again. "For the longest time, I thought the only way to be appreciated was to be impressive. But the truth is, being consistent, thoughtful, that matters more." Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's something people remember. The feeling of being safe, of being known." Later that afternoon, Daniel returned from his errands and found the kitchen still full of the warm scent of their earlier meal. Claire handed him a plate with a leftover zucchini cake and yogurt. He tasted it and nodded approvingly. "This is good," he said. "Actually really good." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Better than the spirulina muffins?" Daniel laughed. "Miles better." They all sat for a while, and even after the food was gone, no one was in a rush to leave the table. Claire shared more about the classes, about how she had stopped visiting the wellness forums, how she now kept her screen time in check and preferred flipping through community recipe board at the local co-op. Margaret listened, noting the shift not just in content, but in tone. Claire no longer spoke like someone trying to convince others, or herself. She simply shared, honestly and without embellishment. Before Margaret left that day, Claire handed her a recipe card. "It's the one we made together today," she said. "But I wrote your name in the corner. I think it belongs to both of us now." Margaret took the card, her voice quiet. "Then I'll treasure it." As she stepped outside, a soft breeze carried the scent of mint and herbs from the open window. For the first time in many months, Margaret felt that her daughter-in-law was not just experimenting in the kitchen, but truly learning how to nourish, not just with food, but with presence, humility, and care. The following month unfolded with a quiet kind of momentum. Claire, now rooted in a more balanced rhythm, had begun to enjoy the process of cooking again, not as a performance or a personal challenge, but as a way to gather, to care, and to express. Daniel noticed it first in the way she moved through their kitchen, humming softly as she measured ingredients, or how she laughed when something didn't go exactly as planned. There was lightness now, where once there had been pressure. So when Claire suggested hosting the next family lunch, there was no hesitation. It wasn't a declaration of redemption or a grand show. It was simply a gesture of continuation, a moment to share, now grounded in clarity. Margaret received the invitation in the form of a brief call, simple and direct. "I'm planning a lunch for Sunday," Claire said. "Just the family. I'd love it if you could come. I've thought a lot about the menu, and I think you'll approve." Margaret smiled to herself. "I have no doubt. I'll be there." Sunday arrived with soft skies and a light breeze. Margaret wore a simple cream blouse and brought along a small basket of rosemary focaccia she'd made the night before. Claire's recent passion for traditional flavors had sparked her own culinary instincts. When she arrived, the house was filled with warm, welcoming scents, roasted vegetables, a hint of garlic, and the buttery notes of something baking. Claire opened the door, radiant in her simplicity, her apron already stained from hours of work. "Come in," she said. "We're almost ready." The table had been set with modest care. Linen napkins folded neatly beside simple white plates, a pitcher of lemon water catching the sunlight, and a single vase of fresh garden blooms, wild daisies, lavender sprigs, and one bright sunflower at the center. Diane was already seated, chatting with Daniel, who was pouring sparkling water into glasses. Claire led Margaret to her seat and then disappeared briefly into the kitchen. Moments later, she returned with the main dish, a savory vegetable galette on a wooden board, the crust golden, the filling rich with roasted squash, caramelized onions, and crumbled goat cheese. Alongside it, she placed a bowl of leafy greens tossed in a homemade vinaigrette, and a smaller dish of roasted beets with orange segments. Margaret looked around the table, observing the quiet smiles, the air of anticipation, and the absence of unease. It was a meal, just a meal, and that was what made it extraordinary. As they served themselves, Claire narrated softly, "The galette is based on a recipe from a book Margaret lent me, with a few of my touches. The vinaigrette uses mustard seed and honey, nothing fancy, just what felt right." Diane took a bite, paused, and looked up. "Claire, this is wonderful. The crust is perfect. I didn't know squash could taste like this." Claire laughed gently. "Neither did I, but I'm learning." Daniel, already halfway through his first slice, gave a satisfied nod. "This is better than the fancy dinners we've tried at that new place downtown. Less salt," Claire noted with a smirk, "and no dry ice." Margaret, now tasting the salad, added her own quiet praise. "The balance is lovely. You found your rhythm, Claire. It shows." There were no awkward silences, no hovering tension, just a flow of natural conversation. Stories, jokes, memories. Diane recalled a childhood vacation gone wrong. Daniel told a brief anecdote about a co-worker's dog chewing through his presentation. Claire even shared a moment of vulnerability, recounting a cooking mishap from earlier in the week that had resulted in a smoky mess and an overcooked pan. "We opened all the windows and had peanut butter sandwiches on the porch," she said, grinning. "It might have been the best dinner of the week." When dessert arrived, apple slices baked with cinnamon and topped with oat crumble, the mood lifted even more. There was no elaborate garnish, no hidden superfood, just warmth, spice, and the unmistakable taste of comfort. As everyone relaxed with their tea, Claire took a deep breath and looked at Margaret. "I wanted to say thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on me, for being patient." Margaret met her gaze. "You didn't need saving, Claire. You just needed to see your own strength without the noise." Claire hesitated, then smiled. "And for forgiving me for that coffee." The room chuckled. Diane leaned back. "I still say we framed that cup." A little plaque underneath, "The day we learned." Claire stood and walked to the kitchen counter, returning a moment later with a small, clean porcelain cup. She held it up with theatrical flair. "The original," she said. "No caffeine, no cinnamon, no mystery herbs. Just memory." They all laughed again, and Daniel reached over to place the cup at the center of the table. Margaret looked around at the faces she loved. The moment was small, unassuming, but to her, it shimmered with something rare. A lesson learned not through confrontation or correction, but through care, through showing up again and again. As the afternoon faded and shadows stretched across the walls, Margaret felt the subtle ache of a story gently reaching its middle. Not the end, never the end, but the kind of quiet pause that allows one to breathe before turning the page. Claire walked her to the door later, the breeze catching the edge of her apron. "Thank you for being part of this," she said. Margaret placed a hand on her arm. "You invited me in. I just stayed." They exchanged no promises, no declarations. Just a nod, a smile, and the knowledge that this, finally, was a meal to remember. Autumn arrived quietly, brushing the trees with soft amber tones and cooling the air with a gentler breath. In the weeks following the family lunch, Claire continued to cultivate the new rhythm she had built for herself. Not as a temporary adjustment, but as a lifestyle grounded in attentiveness and balance. The kitchen remained a space of experimentation, but now the experiments were rooted in tradition, memory, and thoughtfulness. Recipes no longer came from questionable corners of the internet, but from cookbooks with stains and handwritten notes, from conversations with Margaret, and even from Diane's recollections of meals long past. One Thursday afternoon, Margaret received a text from Claire. "I've been working on something for you. Can I stop by tomorrow morning?" Margaret replied that she'd be home and left the conversation at that, her curiosity piqued but not pressing. The next day, just after 10 o'clock in the morning, Claire appeared at her front door, bundled in a light coat and carrying a small, carefully wrapped box tied with a ribbon of simple twine. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," she said with a smile. "Not at all. Come in. I was just putting on water for tea." Inside, the scent of fresh lavender lingered faintly from a candle in the hallway. Claire removed her coat and sat at the kitchen table while Margaret poured 2 cups of chamomile tea, placing them down with a nod of familiarity. There were no elaborate brews anymore, no surprise ingredients, just warmth and simplicity. Claire reached for the box and gently pushed it toward Margaret. "This is for you. I've been thinking about that day," the one with the coffee, and about how everything started to shift after it. I didn't know how to say thank you in words that wouldn't feel heavy, so I made something instead. Margaret opened the box slowly. Inside was the original lavender coffee cup, the very one Claire had handed her on that strange 10 Sunday months ago, but it had been carefully cleaned, polished, and now bore something new. At the bottom of the inside, barely visible unless one looked closely, were small hand-painted words. "Listen, learn, love." Claire glanced at her. "I use porcelain paint. It's permanent now. I wasn't sure if you'd find it sentimental or silly." Margaret traced the rim of the cup with her finger, then looked at Claire with a softness in her eyes that needed no translation. "It's perfect." They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their tea, the cup now resting between them on the table like a shared artifact. Margaret recalled how much tension had once surrounded that very object, how it carried not just the bitter smell of questionable ingredients, but also the weight of uncertainty and fear. And now, it had become something else entirely. A reminder not of failure, but of growth. Claire smiled faintly. "I thought of giving it a grand name, something poetic. But I think that moment, that lesson, doesn't need drama, just remembrance." Margaret nodded. Sometimes the smallest things become the most lasting, not because of what they were, but because of what they led to. Claire leaned back in her chair, her fingers wrapped around her mug. "Daniel saw the cup last night. He said we should all switch to chamomile for good. No more mystery brews." Margaret laughed. That might be the wisest health decision he's ever made. They talked for a while longer, not about nutrition or routines, but about simpler things. A new movie Diane had recommended, a book Claire had started reading, a neighbor who had taken up nighttime jogging and wore lights on their ankles. Before she left, Claire stood by the door and hesitated. "You know," she said, "that cup, it wasn't just about what I put in it. It was about what I assumed. I thought care had to be impressive, loud, transformative. But you showed me something else. That care can be quiet, consistent, sometimes even invisible. That it doesn't have to prove anything." Margaret stepped closer and touched her hand. "You found your way there on your own. I was just beside you." Claire smiled, her eyes glinting slightly. "Still, thank you for not making me feel like a failure, for giving me space to grow. You were never a failure, just a little lost. We all are, sometimes. They hugged, not tightly, not dramatically, but with the kind of ease that only comes from mutual understanding. When Claire stepped out into the cool autumn air, she looked lighter, her pace steady as she made her way down the walkway. Margaret returned to the kitchen, picked up the lavender cup, and turned it slowly in her hands. The phrase painted inside seemed to echo the entire journey they had taken together. The quiet beginnings, the tremors of uncertainty, the gentle recalibration of roles and expectations. She washed the cup carefully, dried it, and placed it on the shelf beside her favorite tea mugs. Not hidden away, not placed on display, just accessible, present, something to be used again and again. The late autumn chill began to deepen, brushing the edges of the trees with deeper copper and bronze. The warmth of summer had long faded, but inside Claire and Daniel's home, something new had taken root, a quiet, deliberate sense of continuity. The once fractured relationship between Claire and her in-laws had evolved into something closer to trust, cemented not through grand gestures, but through meals shared, silences respected, and small rituals now slowly turning into tradition. Margaret had suggested, during a quiet phone call one afternoon, the idea of turning their recent rhythm into something recurring. What if we made it official, she asked. A family lunch once a month. Nothing elaborate. Just us. Just real food and real time. Claire didn't hesitate. I'd love that. The idea took shape quickly. Claire proposed the last Sunday of each month. Diane offered to host occasionally, and Margaret volunteered to share recipes from her old collection, handwritten cards with fading ink and the kind of annotations only time can add. They agreed the meals would rotate, each person contributing something they enjoyed preparing, without pressure or expectation. Their first official lunch was set for the last Sunday of November. Claire texted Daniel a grocery list with casual ease and spent the Saturday before chopping, baking, and humming her way through a playlist of soft jazz and acoustic covers. It no longer felt like preparation for a performance. It felt like preparing a home. That Sunday, Margaret arrived first, carrying a small dish of her signature lentil and carrot soup, a recipe Claire had once dismissed in favor of a turmeric-heavy alternative, but now embraced for its honest simplicity. Diane followed shortly after, bringing a warm loaf of rustic bread and a jar of homemade blackberry jam. Claire had prepared a rosemary roast chicken, crispy potatoes with garlic and thyme, and a crisp green salad dressed lightly with olive oil and lemon. For dessert, she'd baked a pear and almond tart, the kind of dessert that doesn't ask to be admired, just enjoyed. As they gathered around the table, the atmosphere was soft and familiar. No candles, no orchestrated centerpieces, just a shared meal and the sound of genuine conversation. Daniel raised his glass of sparkling water, to the first of many, Diane added, and to the absence of spirulina in all its forms. Laughter followed, easy and genuine. During the meal, Claire leaned over to Margaret. I've been adapting some of your recipes, with the nutritionist suggestions. Did you notice I used less salt in the soup? I did, Margaret said, and I didn't miss it. I thought I would. But when I tasted it yesterday, I realized maybe the real flavor comes from the care behind it. Margaret smiled. Now you sound like me. Maybe I'm finally listening. After the dishes were cleared and the tart had been reduced to a few crumbs, the conversation drifted toward plans for the next lunch. Diane offered to host in December and proposed bringing back her childhood favorite. Beef stew with root vegetables slowly simmered. Claire lit up at the idea and immediately asked if she could bring a side dish and dessert. What about that rice pudding you used to make? Diane asked Margaret. I haven't made it in years, Margaret replied, eyes twinkling. But I'd be happy to dust off the recipe. As the afternoon wore on, Claire brought out a simple binder she had been assembling. Not for herself this time, but for all of them. Inside were pages of typed and handwritten recipes, clipped articles, and blank sheets ready to be filled. At the front, she had placed a photo from their last lunch, all of them around the table mid-laughter, with the sun streaming in behind them. I thought we could build this together, Claire said. A family recipe book, not just the food, but what we remember with it. Margaret and Diane flipped through the pages, each touched by the gesture in their own quiet way. "I have a few stories to go with mine," Diane said, turning one of the blank sheets. "Not all flattering, but worth remembering." Claire laughed. "Even better." As the sun began to dip behind the trees and the sky turned a dusky orange, Margaret stood by the window, watching the wind stir the branches. She felt something rare, not excitement or pride, but a deep, steady satisfaction. What had once begun as a quiet concern, as a tension wound tied around instinct and unease, had now unraveled into something far richer. This was no longer about saving anyone or fixing what had gone wrong. It was about building something together, slowly and with intention, a rhythm, a ritual, a tradition. When she turned back, Claire was writing something at the bottom of one of the recipe pages, a small note in blue ink that Margaret could just barely make out. "Sir, with kindness. Always." It was a quiet morning in late December, the kind that settled over the neighborhood like a wool blanket, soft, still, and gently cool. The previous night's frost lingered on the windowsills, casting delicate patterns across the glass. Inside her cozy kitchen, Margaret sipped her tea and watched the steam curl upward in slow spirals. The lavender cup rested in her hands, warm and familiar. It had become her morning companion. Not because of its origin, but because of what it now represented. She leaned back in her chair, the room wrapped in a silence so comforting that it invited reflection. The months behind her carried a kind of weight she hadn't anticipated when she first walked through Daniel and Claire's front door on that sunny Sunday. The memory of that day remained clear. Claire's nervous smile, the suspicious scent of the coffee, the swift decision to switch cups, and the tension that followed. At the time, she had thought it was instinct, and perhaps it was. But now, in retrospect, she saw it as something deeper, a quiet wisdom earned through years of observation, patience, and learning to listen without immediately reacting. That moment, seemingly small, had been the start of something far more significant than she could have imagined. It had never been about malice or danger. Claire had not been trying to harm anyone. She had simply lost herself in the noise, in the pursuit of approval, control, and meaning. And perhaps that, more than anything, was what Margaret had come to understand, that people rarely lose their way with loud, dramatic turns. More often, they drift quietly, slowly, one unchecked habit or belief at a time. But Claire had found her way back. Margaret looked over at the open notebook on the counter, the family recipe book they had been building together for several weeks now. Pages filled with memories had begun to take shape. Beside each recipe, someone had added a note, a date, a story, a small scribble that captured the essence of that meal. Claire's handwriting appeared often, sometimes tentative, sometimes bolder. There was a confidence in her words now, not loud, not boastful, but rooted in something real. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Claire, bundled in a navy coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. In her hands was a small paper bag. "Morning," she said, smiling. "I brought something." Margaret stepped aside and let her in. Claire removed her coat and set the bag on the counter, pulling out a small tin wrapped in wax paper. "Hazelnut biscuits," she said. "Diane's recipe, my attempt. I made a batch last night and thought they turned out well enough to share." Margaret opened the tin, inhaled the scent, and smiled. "They smell exactly like the ones Diane used to bring to the book club. She'll be pleased." Claire sat at the table while Margaret poured 2 cups of tea. They settled into the familiar rhythm of comfortable conversation. "I've been thinking a lot about the beginning," Claire said after a pause. "About how much has changed. I almost can't believe I was so sure I had to fix everyone through food." "You weren't trying to fix," Margaret said. "You were trying to show love. You just hadn't figured out the best way yet." Claire looked out the window, and all it took was one strange-smelling coffee and a swap cup to get there. Margaret chuckled. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest instincts. There was a brief silence before Claire spoke again, her voice softer. "I think I was afraid that if I didn't contribute something impressive, I'd be invisible, that I'd become just another daughter-in-law in a quiet house." Margaret shook her head slowly. "You're not invisible. You never were. You just needed someone to see you as you are, not as who you thought you had to be. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wanted to add this to the recipe book. Not a recipe, just a letter. Margaret unfolded the page and read it silently. It was a heartfelt reflection, not dramatic or apologetic, but honest. Claire had written about the journey from obsession to balance, from isolation to connection. She had written about learning to ask for help, to accept feedback, to rebuild trust without fear of judgment. And at the bottom, she had signed it simply, "To my family, who taught me that care is not measured in effort, but in presence. Thank you for helping me come back to myself." Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in the notebook between two well-used pages. "That belongs there," she said. As they sipped their tea, the sun began to rise higher, casting golden light across the countertop. It was a kind of morning that felt both ordinary and rare, unremarkable on the surface, but filled with the quiet weight of what had been earned. Later, Daniel would join them for lunch. Diane would arrive with another jar of jam, and they would sit together around a table once more, not because they had to, not out of obligation or tradition, but because they had come to understand the value of shared space, shared time, and shared care. Margaret looked again at the lavender cup, now just a vessel for chamomile tea. The transformation had been slow, subtle, and deeply human. No grand turning point, no dramatic lesson, just a moment of pause, a decision to listen, a willingness to change. And in the end, that had been more than enough. As the final part closes, this journey, born from quiet concern, shaped by vulnerability, and strengthened through connection, settles not with applause, but with peace, a peace well earned.